Thank you very much, Jim, for that kind introduction. You've been a little bit, I've been fighting the climate alarm for 33 years. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I've been working on climate much longer than that. But in any event, here we are, we're dealing with global hysteria. And the question is, how did we get here? At any rate, for 33 years, there have been a lot of us who've actually been battling against climate. You may think at this point that you're a beleaguered minority, and we are. But, when the issue broke in '88, there were numerous outstanding people, heads of WMO, heads of Max Planck, heads of Scripps, all these major institutions. There were people at Lawrence Livermore, which today deals with the climate model comparisons, like Hugh Elsasser. It could go on at great length. There are many important leading people who are objecting to it. And they were unfortunately older. And by now, most of them are dead. But in any event, the arguments have long been around. And in a normal world, I think they'd be compelling. I mean, let me push this out of the way. We've pointed out that the sensitivity of the models is exaggerated. The role of other processes than CO2 and, in fact, natural internal variability are extremely important. We've pointed to the inconsistency of the paleoclimate record, which unambiguously shows that CO2 is not a control knob. We've noted the absence of evidence for increased extremes, hurricanes, and so on. And for that matter, so has the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That seems to have had no impact on the propaganda. We've also pointed out the very real benefits of CO2 and even of modest warming. I mean, how many people retire to the Arctic, as compared to those who retire to Florida? And as concerns government policies, the fact of the matter is we've been pretty darn ineffective. Indeed, our efforts do little other than to suggest to many people that there is a debate and that we take the threat scenario seriously, which in fact I don't think we do. In this talk, I'd like to make a tentative analysis of our failure. In any event, in punching away at the clear shortcomings of the narrative of climate alarm, I think maybe, just maybe, we've missed the most serious shortcoming, namely that the whole narrative is pretty absurd. Of course, many people, though by no means all, have great difficulty entertaining this possibility. They can't believe that anything so absurd could gain such universal acceptance. Now consider the following somewhat analogous situation. Let's say you go to your physician and you're arranging for a complete physical examination. Your physician then responds that a complete physical examination would consist simply in taking your temperature. You'd immediately be suspicious that there's something wrong with your physician. If he further claims that if your temperature is 37.3 centigrade, rather than between 36.1 and 37.2, you must be put on life support. Now you know he is certifiably insane. And yet the same situation, when applied to climate, a comparably complex system with a much more poorly defined index, globally average temperature anomaly, is considered, quote, settled science. Now, as concerns this index, the index again is something commonly called global temperature. You might wonder, why is this a poor index? And in order to do so, it pays to learn how it was obtained. And so I'll make a brief digression on that. You know, if you think about it for a moment, it's obviously meaningless to speak of global mean temperature. I mean, how would you average the temperature for the Dead Sea or Mount Everest? And of course, they don't do that. They don't do that. Instead, one takes 30 years of 30-year annual means or seasonal means at each station, and then takes the deviation from these means and averages those. The results are referred to as annual or seasonal mean anomalies. Now, I'm going to show a couple of figures, several, in which we'll see how it was actually done. And we're going to show you things that you don't see in the figures that you're commonly shown. So, for example, if I go down here, here what you see is the data points. They're in black, and then a sort of orange line in the middle. That is the average of the data points. And this is for annual means. If you use seasonal means, which in some ways is more relevant, you get this. And if you look carefully, as you should, at any graph, you always should look at the lines, essentially the numbers. And if you look at the horizontal axis, you see it's ranging from 1900 to 2020. If you look at the vertical axis, you're going essentially from -12 to 12, or most of it is between -8 and 8. But for the orange thing in the middle, you're barely moving 1 degree. And so if you were to be shown that, and you're saying, well, you know, you better go berserk, look at the way it's going up, you'd scratch your head. But that isn't what you're shown. What you're shown instead is something like this. Now, there are two things about this to note. One, of course, you've left out the data points, so you don't know the scatter. If you went back to the data points, they tell you something rather critical. They tell you that at each individual station, at any given point, you're almost as likely to be cooling as warming, even though there's a slight warming trend. And so, you know, relating single stations to this mean is pretty poor. At any rate, what you've done here is leave out the data points, and you have stretched the scale. You notice it's no longer going from -8 to 8. It's going from roughly -0.8 to 1.2. You've essentially increased the size, the resolution by a factor of 10. Now, that tiny change you saw before relative to what's going on in any particular place looks huge. Of course, it's wiggling quite a lot, so you get rid of that by what's called smoothing. It's usually using running means. That is, say each point is actually an average over 5 to 10 or even more years. But in any event, you know, looking at the wiggles is telling you also that these fluctuations of plus or minus 0.2 of a degree are no big deal. They're probably meaningless. And yet the media, if it goes up by 1/10 of a degree, you know, will tell you we've had a record-breaking year. I mean, this is kind of sad in a way. And of course, as this illustration shows, it may be hard for people to read. You know, we normally handle huge changes in temperature compared to what we see changing over the last 120 years. By the way, what we see over the last 120 years is the thickness of this black line. And virtually anything, including the temperature change we encounter between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., is bigger than that. And, you know, if you went to the temperature extremes at any of these locations, you're dealing with, let's see here, 35 to 75 degrees, you know, 40 degrees. And here we're worried about tenths of a degree. You're being told that even though the 1 degree, 1.2 degrees that this represents were accompanied by the greatest increase in human welfare in history, that another few tenths of a degree are doomed. This is nonsense. Okay, so that's why, even compared to your body temperature, this is a pretty poor index, and it may not even be a good measure of climate. Okay, so there we are. We have this very funny measurement. And where do we go? Well, if this weren't silly enough, we're bombarded with claims that the impacts of this climate change include such things as obesity and the Syrian civil war. The claims of impacts are then circularly claimed to be overwhelming evidence of dangerous climate change. Remember what I mean by circularly. You know, in most cases, these were not predicted by any model even. They just sounded ominous. So one claimed them and then claimed in the reverse of any logical procedure that they were evidence for the correctness of predictions that had not predicted them. I suppose circular may not do full justice to the ridiculousness of the claim. And it doesn't matter that most of these claims are wrong or irrelevant. It doesn't matter that none of these claims can be related to CO2 except via model projections. And in almost all cases, even the model projections are non-existent. That is to say, the narrative is almost completely an invented one. Somehow the sheer volume of misinformation seems to overwhelm us. In case you retain any skepticism, there is America's new climate czar, John Kerry's claim that climate, as he admits, unlike physics and chemistry, is so simple that any child can understand it. And presumably, if you can't see the existential danger of CO2, you're a stupid denier. In any event, the situation is even more bizarre when you get to the governmental response. This response is entirely analogous to a situation that a colleague, Bruce Everett, he's a member of the CO2 Coalition, but he also taught energy economics at Tufts University. Here's his description. After your physical, your physician tells you that you may have a fatal disease. He's not really sure, but he proposes a treatment that will be expensive and painful while offering no prospect of preventing the disease. When you ask, why would you ever agree to such a thing? He says he just feels obligated to quote, do something. That is precisely what the Paris Accord amounts to. However, the something also gives governments the power to control the energy sector, and this is something many governments cannot resist. Information is unlikely to change this, and it won't change it despite the fact that even the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, at least the scientific part, acknowledges that their warming claims would only reduce the immensely expanded gross domestic product by 2 to 3% by the end of the century, something that is trivially manageable and hardly existential. In trying to understand the success of this claim that climate change due to CO2 is an existential threat, I propose to look at an analogous scare. namely the widespread fear in the United States in the early 20th century of an epidemic of feeble-mindedness. I'll also return to C.P. Snow's two-culture description in order to see why the alarmist scenario appeals primarily to the so-called educated elite rather than to the common people. Almost every study shows that most people do not take climate alarm as the existential threat that is proposed to be. Over 25 years ago, I wrote a paper comparing this panic in the US in the early 1920s over the epidemic of feeble-mindedness and the current fear of cataclysmic climate change. And the paper is available to anyone who emails me, asks for it. During this early period, the counterpart, and I'm talking about the 1920s, of environmentalism was eugenics. Instead of climate physics as the underlying science, we had genetics. And instead of overturning the energy economy, we had immigration restriction, at least in the US. Both advocacy movements were characteristically concerned with purity. Environmentalism with purity of the environment, eugenics with purity of the gene pool. But there's an important point that was interesting to discover, namely that eugenics did not start with a focus on genes. The movement was started around 1880 by British biometricians who used statistical analysis to study human evolution. Among them were some of the founders of modern statistics like Pearson and Fisher, which almost anyone who's studied statistics, these are names you've heard of. And the analysis they gave was mathematically sophisticated, not surprisingly. It should also come as no surprise that the movement didn't really catch on. It was a very minor movement until Mendelian genetics was rediscovered around 1900. And things like feeble-mindedness were then suggested to be associated with a single recessive gene. Now, what this illustrates is that such movements need an easily understood, allegedly scientific, even if actually pretty absurd, narrative. The people needing such narratives are not the ordinary system, but rather our educated elites. Prominent supporters of eugenics included Theodore Roosevelt, Margaret Sanger, who was the racist founder of Planned Parenthood, the Bishop of Ripon, I hope I've pronounced that right, George Bernard Shaw, Havelock Ellis, and many, many others. The supporters also included technically adept individuals like Alexander Graham Bell. They were technically adept, but not in genetics. They also need a policy goal. In the early 1920s, Americans became concerned with immigration, and it was argued that America was threatened with an epidemic of feeble-mindedness due allegedly to immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Now, I won't spend a lot of time going over this. It is in a paper, but here are the major takeaway points of the comparison. The first one is that elites are always searching for ways to advertise their virtue and assert the authority they believe they are entitled to. Two, they view science as a source of authority rather than a process, and they try to appropriate science suitably and incorrectly simplified as the basis for their movement. Movements need goals, and these goals are usually embedded in legislation. Of course, the legislation might be desired for other reasons, and there is a kind of symbiotic relation that goes on between the movements, and the scientists, and the political system. Of course, when legislation is enacted, unfortunately, it long outlasts the alleged science. In the case of Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 in the US, it lasted until 1964. And finally, as long as scientists are rewarded for doing so, they are unlikely to oppose the exploitation of science. Now, in the case of eugenics, government funding was not at issue. This is in contrast to climate, where government plays an overwhelming role as essentially holding a monopoly over science. And so, although government may support good science, if the government has a particular interest in a particular scientific outcome, it has all the means of encouraging it among scientists. But, you know, in the 1920s, private funding did play a role. I mean, there was the Carnegie Foundation, I think the Ford Foundation. They supported a lot of the research that was used to support the hysteria concerning immigration. And for scientists also, there was the reward that came simply from public recognition of their relevance. The next slide gives an example of this. Is Herbert Spencer Jennings. He is a professor of genetics at Johns Hopkins University, and he may well have been the leading figure in his field in his day. In his 1930 book, The Biological Basis of Human Nature, he states, "Gone are the days when the biologist used to be pictured in the public prints as an absurd creature, his pockets bulging with snakes and newts. Today," he claimed, "the world is to be operated on scientific principles. The conduct of life and society are to be based, as they should be, on sound biological maxims. Biology has become popular." Now, this was his public stance. Privately, Jennings actually opposed the political exploitation of genetics. Now, we come to C.P. Snow's discussion in 1959 of the two cultures. He suggests why it is the educated elite that is most vulnerable to the absurd narrative. Snow, as you probably know, was an English physicist, novelist, government advisor, and so on. Here is his description of the non-scientific elite. "A good many times I've been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I've been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration? Which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. Well, you know, I think there's ample evidence that Snow's observation remains correct. And I think we often forget the fact that when we talk about science, we're talking to people who have no idea even of the vocabulary. I have the feeling personally, if I were to ask people, including the over 200 who are in attendance at this talk what the basic underlying equation of the climate models is, I'd get almost as negative a response. Just for the record, it's the Navier-Stokes equations for fluid mechanics. What C.P. Snow may have failed to note as well, I think, is the group he describes is actually aware of their scientific ignorance. And this leaves them very insecure. I think this accounts for their need for the simple narratives, however wrong. It allows them to believe that they actually do, quote, understand the science. And as we see today with climate, they become arrogantly proud of their alleged accomplishment, vis-a-vis Al Gore. Of course, they forget that their ignorance extends to understanding what science actually is. They forget that the opposite of science is, quote, the science. We only have science. The science is a contradiction in terms. It's always open to question. It's always open to examination. As the hackers who intervened with the original version of this talk would have it, you never question the political agenda. And to call it the science is misleading. The situation is compounded when one comes to climate, where most scientists are also ignorant, but where their support for the narrative comforts the non-scientists. On top of all this, I suspect that in a long period of well-being, this elite feels the need to show they too have met challenges, even if the challenges are purely imaginary. This seems particularly true of young people who are confronted with stories of the courage of the greatest generation. Also somewhat reminds me of Hayek's criticism of engineers, that they love to solve problems whether they exist or not. Now, I should repeat that most ordinary people don't have these problems. And that brings us to the task that we have. And that's the last slide here. Our task is to show the relevant people, people who make the decisions for us, political people, the overall stupidity of this issue, rather than punching away at details. In focusing on the details, we are merely trying to showcase our own specialties, a kind of vanity. My use of the word merely is probably unjustified. The details can, in fact, be scientifically important. However, we're not considering either our target audience or the intrinsic absurdity of the issue. After all, we're asking people to accept that the atmosphere and the ocean are turbulent fluids that are unlike any other turbulent fluid in the universe, all of which have autonomous variability. It's asking us to ignore the fact that in the long history of the Earth, there has been virtually no correlation between climate and CO2. I don't know, why we can't get this across, but I think it is likely we have to capitalize on the insecurity of the educated elite and make them look silly instead of superior and virtuous. We must remember that they are impervious to real science unless it is reduced to their level. And when it is reduced to their level, it is imperative for us that we retain veracity. Whether we are capable of effectively doing this is an open question. With that, I end my lecture. Thank you.